Hey everyone, how's it going? What's up? This is Finite MTG, aka Max, and I'm here with Crackshot, aka Jacob.
Hey everybody.
And today we have a lot to talk about on this podcast episode. So I'm going to be breaking down Temur Cube, VMA, briefly going over the Tinkerer's Cube as well. And then, yeah, we even have Kaldheim to talk about because that will be coming out very soon. And yeah, we'll get a new alternative play calendar when that happens. So excited for all of that, of course.
Yeah, Temur Cube. I did enjoy it. Wasn't my favorite experience, but it certainly wasn't bad at all. And yeah, it really feels different to play a 3-color cube. I have not done that before. I missed the times when the Grixis Cube was online. Have you played the Grixis Cube?
Yeah, I did play the Grixis Cube. I think I have some drafts of that format on my channel somewhere. I think it's like titled Format Solved or something because I forced mono red and trophied twice in a row.
Oh, well. That's something you could do in the Temur Cube as well, the forcing mono red.
That is something I did actually, literally, the forcing mono red and trophying twice in a row. That was, yeah, like pretty much my same experience. But back then it was just, about trying to win and like do as well as possible. This time it's more like, what am I losing to? I'm trying to see how the other archetypes are doing and whether they're really resilient to mono red. And I think they actually were. There were a couple matches I was very, very close to losing, especially versus mono green cards like Elder Gargaroth. So yeah,
there were some big, beefy, strong creatures that were hard for red to deal with.
For sure. I think this cube is actually better positioned against mono red than the Grixis Cube was, which is kind of interesting.
Okay. I had the feeling that some green decks really had a problem with the burn from red, but I played against it with a blue-red more controlling deck and targeted my spells only at their mana elves. And I think what I played against was somebody trying to play an elf tribal deck, and it just really didn't go well for them at all.
Yeah, fair.
I don't know.
Do they have like Eladamri in their deck?
I did not see that one, but there was the Arch Druid. Is it Elvish Arch Druid or something like that? That taps for every elf, and then a bunch of 1 and 2 mana elves, some of which are pretty random.
Right.
I think they also had the sad Heritage Druid in there, and So I don't know. That's if all the themes came together in this cube. I'm not sure because maybe the environment was a bit too hazardous to some of them.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty decent observation. I think that this is not the first time recently we've had one of these cubes try to put together like an artifact deck, like without really putting too much artifact synergy like throughout the cube. And especially like, when you take out a bunch of the best mana rocks, there were still some very good mana rocks in here, don't get me wrong, but artifact synergy and artifact interaction gets that much better when like the incentives are higher. But still, we've had some pretty kind of dubious artifact archetypes in past cubes. I think this one was a bit more promising than that. But yeah, I do think that I think that some of the archetypes, as you pointed out, were just not quite there in terms of support. And there were just like some questionable cards in general, in my opinion, at least. Like you have like one of the best things you can do, as usual in Cube, is Splinter Twin, right? You just put together 2 cards and win the game, pretty much.
Yeah.
Very hard to really beat the Splinter Twin combo once it's going. And yeah, there were a bunch of other cards from 2-card combos without like the other half of the combo, which is kind of interesting. For instance, we had like Manifold Key, right? The strictly better Voltaic Key, but no Time Vault.
I'm pretty sure that this combo is one of the only things that were cut from the MTGO Vintage Cube for power level reasons.
Fair. Yeah.
Because I kind of like that it's not here, but that said, I'm not happy about the keys. I think they don't have a place.
Yeah. I'm not saying like because Splinter Twin is here, we have to have other 2-card combos. I think it's more like, you know, maybe there's a reason the other 2-card combos aren't here. So maybe Splinter Twin shouldn't be here either.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I mentioned Eladamri when you were talking about the Elf tribal deck is because Eladamri was one of those cards that I consistently saw going very late. It seems like a card that probably is not quite there in terms of power level, along with
in
other...
this environment. I really like the card in general, like, and the occasional tribal support in the cube. I also really like that.
Fair, yeah. Yeah, I think some other choices that were pretty interesting to us would be like Cloudstone Curio, yeah, Candelabra, just cards that you can do silly things with, but most of the time it's either not going to be worth it or it's going to be too hard to set up.
Yeah, they require a lot of setup, I think. And I'm all for cards that require a lot of setup and then you build your engine. And I really like that, but I'm not sure if the power level of the other cards in the format allowed that. Just like random cards like Hex Drinker, one of my least favorite cards. Like, not in this cube, but in general. I just really don't like the card. If you have cards of that power level in there that don't need anything else to happen except for you hitting a few land drops, like you're pushing out cute interactions. And I mean, I think you can have it either way, but not both at the same time, I feel like.
Yeah, I think that's right. And not just Hex Drinker, right? This cube was what's called like semi-powered. So you didn't have like the power 9, except for Time Twister, I believe. But you did have cards that are like honorary power 9. So you had like Mana Crypt, Library of Alexandria, just some of the best cards in Magic that are not quite, you know, known as power 9, which that'll matter more when we get into Vintage Masters as well. And I think that's a pretty interesting choice. I think there are some places where it might make sense, but for the most part, I tend to think that if you're putting cards that are so insanely good, like that they are near the power 9, you better have a good reason for playing, like for including those and not including the power 9 themselves. And I just felt like this was almost like Vintage Cube in the sense that the semi-powered cards are so much better than almost everything else going on that you just always took them if they showed up. The way in Vintage Cube, you just always pick power 9 first.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to say is that might make it sound like you couldn't do any fun things, and that's not true at all. There were a lot of fun things you could do and a lot of things that were viable, and it was a good experience playing this cube. And it comes back to something we very often discuss, which is the pack size. With a pack size of 15, if the last 5 cards or 4 cards are basically unplayables, it doesn't even matter that much, right? They just become invisible and they fall out of your cube basically. So I think it would have been a very similar play experience if this cube was cut down to maybe 440 cards. All the things that don't work out were removed from the packs, and you would just draft with 11 card, 12 card packs. I think that would have turned out very similarly.
Yeah, I think 11 and 12 might be a little bit low, but for the most part, I agree. There are a couple cards that I think are in here mainly as sideboard cards. I mentioned Eladamri before because I just don't really know what it does in a main deck. But I was going to say Defense Grid. That's another card that I really can't imagine putting in my main deck.
Yeah.
But there weren't too many cards like that, so I think 12, maybe 13 cards, I agree, it would have looked very similar. There's another interesting design choice here, and we saw this, I believe, or something very similar in Cultic Cube. So here we had repeat fetches and repeat shocks, so 2 copies of each like fetch and shock that's in a Temur guild. And that was interesting because I mean, it always draws like a really visceral like reaction from players. Players are like what? I thought this was a cube. Why are there like what's going on?
It's impure.
Yeah, it's like cube is so like well known to be like synonymous with singleton that people just don't think that it can be a cube if there are two copies of a card. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think you can definitely like break this pretty basic rule of cube if it makes the format better.
I have to say here I like this choice much more because these are good cards, but here you go from 3 to 6 from the fetch lands. So you still have a relatively low number of fetch lands compared to the size of the cube.
Right.
And not from 10 to 20. Like it's very different. And here it didn't very often happen that you saw 2 of the same fetch land. I guess I would say I even like the choice.
Yeah. I don't think including original duels over that second copy of all the shocks would really do anything to the power level. And I do think it would help. That would actually be much closer to the choice of the cultic cube, if I remember correctly, because I think that cube only had repeat fetches. So yeah, I don't know. It just seemed like, again, with semi-powered things, this is not like a very low-powered cube. So
not at all. Yeah.
I was definitely interested as to why those didn't show up. So now you wanted to talk about 8 cards, is that right? And answers?
Yeah. So what I noticed in this cube is the creator played with cards that were always considered color hate. And I want to diverge a little bit from that meaning. So in the original meaning, you would think that something like Pyroblast is a hate card. And now I want to talk about hate cards versus answers. And in this context, I would say that Pyroblast is an answer. It's a 1-for-1 spell. It's very efficient, and it might not work in every matchup. So it might still be a sideboard card, but it doesn't blow somebody out completely. It doesn't stop them from playing the game. And there were some other cards in this cube which I felt like were, for my taste, a little bit too much on the side of a hate card. For example, there was the card Dragon Predator for 1 green and blue, a 2/3 flyer that when it deals combat damage to an opponent, you destroy target enchantment or artifact they control. And while I generally don't mind this card at this power level, I feel like it can lead to some very frustrating scenarios when somebody's actually drafting the intended archetype of artifact matters. Like when you build your whole deck around playing the good or some even not so good mana rocks in this cube to then do something, play a big artifact after that, and somebody plays a turn 3 Dragon Predator against you, you basically have to have removal or you lost the game.
A lot of things that I want to respond to with that, but I guess for starters, I'll just say, so one example of Trigon not functioning like a hate card would be against mono red, where maybe you have Shrine of Burning Rage and Jitte like I did, but you can just keep dumping creatures into play so Trigon doesn't cost you the game. And then you eventually can play and equip the Jitte and attack, and then you can kill the Trigon if they block, or maybe they attack and you just shrink its power to 0 with the Jitte. So that would be an example of it like not being oppressive. But yeah, I think for the most part, like the red and blue blasts acted really nicely I think that Trigon here, specifically because they're supposed to be like an artifact archetype, it was less of an answer and more of a hate card.
Yeah, like if I don't know, there were not as many artifacts and there were like signets in all combinations and everybody would be running like 3-4 signets, then Trigon could be maybe just a very strong card. And in some matchups, it's not really a hate card, but just a good card for you. But yeah, I don't know if you need to hate, if you should hate on archetypes that much. And I mean, it is a way of balancing your cube, but I think it's not a very fun experience. I already heard from some people that another card in this cube is Mindbreak Trap. So it's for 4 blue, an instant. And when you play it, you exile any number of spells, I believe, is the way it's worded. Let me...
Yeah. Exile any number of spells, or any number of target spells, I think.
And any number of target spells, yeah.
If 3+ spells were cast that turn, you can just, cast it for 0 mana. So.
Yeah. And that card, I don't know, is on the brink for me between being a hate card and an answer, because Storm is in the cube. At the end, when they exhausted all their resources, you don't spend any mana and you undo everything they did. And
sounds like fun.
yeah, I don't know. Like, it's super frustrating for one player.
Oh, of course.
And I don't know if that's great. Like, this card I can still see. It's very defendable, and I might have included it. But this is really, I think, already on the brink of being hateful. I don't know.
Yeah. I think I would just go ahead and call that card a hate card. But I think that something interesting about the Trigon Predator, and possibly another reason you dislike it, is because it's another type of card that we're not a huge fan of, which is a snowball card. In the sense that it just like repeatedly is able to incur value and make the game state worse for your opponent. That's
I guess in that matchup it is.
Right. And that's not something you see on the Mind Break Trap. So I I think that could be a reason that you're more opposed to the Trigon, because there's another reason I think you might dislike it.
Yeah,
But
I guess.
something that I noticed when you were describing the distinction between answers and hate cards is you mentioned that the middle ground is like a 2-for-1. So like Force of Vigor, that's a 2-for-1. Even Rex Sage is a 2-for-1, as opposed to something like a Nature's Claim or something like that.
Yeah.
But so that kind of talk reminded me of my talk in like peasant cubes and just lower powered environments in general about removal versus like sweepers, right? Because a lot of people think sweepers are really important for most like cube environments. I think with a low enough powered environment, sweepers basically just turn into hate cards, right? And I think that answers like spot removal and even strong answers like 2-for-1s are just generally much more acceptable. I think basically this distinction that you're proposing is like a really nice way of framing that argument that I've had for a while.
To sum it up, I would say that the real hate cards, they stop one archetype from doing anything.
Okay. Well, I think that was a really interesting topic. Time to move on to Vintage Masters.
I would talk about the Tinkerer's Cube first,
Sure.
because the Tinkerer's Cube does pretty much that. And it's the first time that I see like an officially supported cube do that. So it's the lower powered cube of the two cubes we get on Arena regularly. And it has very little mass removal. It has for 7 mana the Star of Extinction. So for 5 red, it destroys a land and 20 damage to each creature and planeswalker. Then it has in black-green the Find Finality. So it's another sweeper for 6 mana, -4/-4, and you put 2+1/+1 counters on up to one creature. And that is basically it. There's in black one, there's not really a mass removal. The Witch's Vengeance, 1 black creatures of the creature type of your choice get -3/-3 until end of turn. And that is it in a 540 card cube. So yeah, it's a lot. They're doing it basically like we just advertised. And this does work best at relatively low power levels, and this is a lower power level, though they have some cards that I think are a little bit too strong. But in general, the cube plays out in a similar fashion to our peasant cubes. So there's a lot of archetype focus and a lot of room for these archetypes to do their thing. And then at some point, something wins. So there's blue-white flyers, and there's green-white. Green-white has a bunch of mixed things. Like green-white has tokens. It has Enchantress support. It has some token support. And which is one thing. Like, it's less like ours in that color pairs sometimes do more than one thing. And the archetypes are often spread around more than just 2 colors. So, like the +1/+1 counter thing, for example, stretches to blue. There's a bunch of blue proliferators also that go with the white, green +1/+1 counter theme. And yeah, so it's a little bit. It sometimes can feel a little bit all over the place, because it's not. You don't quite as quickly grasp which colors should do which archetype, basically. But I think it still plays very well. It feels very balanced, and with the exception of a few cards like Hazoret, some people are complaining about, and I myself think that 1 white, 1/1 Luminarch Aspirant, which puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control at the beginning of combat. I think that card's just a little bit too strong for what the rest of the cube does, but it's not like completely crazy out of whack. So yeah, I think it's a very nice play experience. I enjoy it more than the other cube, but some people dislike that it doesn't really have much top end. Like there's no real payoff if you ramp, for example. But there are still some cards that accelerate your mana. So if you are leaning into the ramp, then in the end you will not have much to do. But in general, I like it a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like an experience that I think most people do enjoy a lot. I wanted to actually talk about, I think, a tweet that I saw from Brian David Marshall, and it's about, I don't know if, I would imagine most listeners have not seen this, but it's this video of a child's toy where there are a bunch of different shapes and holes for shapes, and turns out that every shape can be put through the square hole, even though each shape has its own hole, like designated for it. And BDM said, like, this is how he imagines the creator of Tinker's Cube must feel when people just keep doing well with mono red over and over. They're just putting, you know, whatever shape it is through that square hole. Yeah, I thought it was really funny. But I also thought that there is something like there to it as well. Like that's a real problem. Like I am basically the person like forcing the wrong shape through the square hole. Like granted, not in Tinkerer's Cube, but
I mean, I also did it in Tinkerer's Cube. It's one of my go-to things for the very first draft. When you when you only look at the first pack, sometimes it's very hard to see which archetypes are actually supported, which card might lead me astray. And somehow mono red is always in the cards and nobody else will take your cards. If you just force mono red in the first draft, then you will see like all the cards going around the table and you can inform your opinion for the next draft. I mean, you can also just look at the cube list or do a test draft against bots on Cube Cobra. These are all also very valid. But sometimes I just feel like jumping in, and then if there's a good mono red card in my first pack, then I might be forcing mono red in the beginning.
Fair enough. And I do think there's something to like having simple and intuitive archetypes, because not everyone does read like cube articles. Not everyone has a lot of experience with cubes, and sometimes archetypes can lead people astray a little bit, like what you were describing with the ramp deck. But I would say the main problem I have with mono red being as viable an archetype as it is, just in cubes in general. But for instance, the Temur Cube, I think, would be a good place to say this. Like, that cube is pretty strong in terms of power level. Definitely, I would say, toward the higher end of how strong things can be. And yet you have cards like Hellrider and Rabblemaster that I'm just not sure about, because they're just so good just about every time in the mono red deck. And I feel like when you try to encourage all these really complex and interesting archetypes, making mono red as powerful as it is really discourages that. And granted, I do think that mono red wasn't just at its absolute strongest. I think it's been worse in the past. But I think that you can make mono red strong without putting the literal best cards into like that archetype. I want to see fewer Hellriders on Magic Online, not just because other people are picking them, but because people are cutting it from their cubes, right? Because it's just such an easy card to win games with otherwise. And I think that takes a lot of the fun out of it. But on the other hand, something nice about drafting sets is that it's a lot harder to force in a set, because in a cube, you can pretty much get away with anything. Everything is going to be so strong, you're not going to have to worry about playables. But for instance, in Vintage Masters, even though it is Vintage Masters, there are still some unplayables, and it's not quite like a cube. So you can't force, you have to actually think and draft if you want to end up with a good deck, especially because so you have Battle Screech at common in Vintage Masters, right? And that card is just completely insane.
The one thing I remember.
Yeah, it's probably the reason that most people stop playing that format, because I think they get battle screeched a couple times and they say, hey, you know what? This wasn't fun. I don't want to try it again. But I was going to say, like, that's not even something you can force, because so many people know that mono white is good that really you still have to pay attention to signals because you don't know whether you'll end up in a pod where you'll get past like 2 or 3 screeches or you'll be in a pod where you get 0.
Yeah, but it's one small difference coming into that. I feel like the mindset is different for people when they head into a cube compared when they head into drafting a set. I think people are way more willing to just draft what is best when they draft a set than when they draft a cube. So even though mono red in Tinkerer's Cube is the best deck, sometimes it's just not drafted and you see 10th pick Hell Riders, which I think also is in there. Not 100% sure, but I think so. And people sometimes just feel like, oh no, I'm not drafting that today. And then if the whole table agrees, then the mono red cards go last pick. And that happens in so many cubes, even though mono red is the best. And in a normal draft set, you can never see that happen, basically. That everybody shuns a color, even though it's the best color. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're saying makes, well, perfect sense to me. Basically, people are more like spikes in regular draft sets. People are more interested in winning, they're more competitive. But in cubes, It sounds like you're saying people are more interested in doing zany, like fun things and trying to, make some sweet memories of winning a game in a crazy way. But that makes me wonder, like, why do we have this super powerful, aggressive archetypes at all? Like, I think that aggro is still important, but if people are trying to do fun things and say mono red cards or mono white cards consistently go super late in drafts of cube, why are they there at all, right? Because isn't that a little bit like unplayables just coming around at the end of a pack if it's an archetype no one wants to play? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's there in case somebody wants it. And I don't know, should it be? Maybe. Like, even the people that say, oh, I like when there's good support for mono red. How often are they going to draft the mono red deck if it's open all the time? Are they really, like, all 7 drafts they do of this font, are they just playing it every time because it's always open? Or will they also at some point get bored and try to do something else? I think that's what happens, actually.
I mean, I think it really varies by player. I think some people play like an above average amount of aggro, and some people play like nearly 100% aggro. And I think, the focus is Magic places on win rate, and not to mention the fact that Magic is not a free game to play. Those really incentivize like being competitive. That's something I think I'd want to return to in a future episode. But anyway, try to get things back toward Vintage Masters. So you said that Battle Screech at common is like the one thing you remember, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because that card at common is just insane. And I mean, the simplest solution would be to like upshift it in terms of rarity, right? Just make it something that shows up less. But I think it's interesting that there actually are multiple like answers to it at common. So you have like Death's Head Buzzard, you have Claws of Wirewood, and granted they're both much, much weaker cards than Battle Screech, but it's still nice. It's reassuring even that these cards are here. So one of the nice things about Vintage Masters, we were talking earlier about Pieces of Power in the Temur Cube, and just how they would feel kind of out of place. And one of the reasons that is because in a cube, everything is opened up with the same frequency, right? There's no such thing as rarity, except for exactly with the fetches and shocks in Temur Cube. And because things show up at the same rate, it doesn't really make sense to have a couple like insanely powerful splashy cards. I do think that makes a little bit more sense in VMA. So you had in Vintage Masters the like regular Power 9 with Vintage Masters art, but you also had the original art Power 9, which were sort of like the first masterpieces, if you will. Unfortunately, this time the flashback was Phantom. So even if you wanted to try to go for the power, you didn't have that choice, which I think was probably a misstep on Wizards' part. Like, you don't lose that much value from making flashbacks either Phantom or non-Phantom, right? And it's such a sweet feeling, I have to say, because I was fortunate enough in the past to have opened original art Ancestral Recall, and then you like trophy your draft, right? Because you have an insane card in your deck and probably like an insane deck if you get it right. And you get to keep like a 60 ticket card or whatever. So
I think it's pretty cool to offer both. But I still think that somehow I would always play Phantom anyway. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a big Phantom player as opposed to non-Phantom generally when there are flashbacks. Like for instance, Modern Horizons. That's because like with Modern Horizons, it's such a deep set. I'm not confident enough in my ability to just have a really good win rate. So I feel like Phantom is just less risky. With Vintage Masters, I feel like it's a really sweet synergistic set, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's as deep or as complex as Modern Horizons. So I was a little more confident in my ability to put together something pretty effective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I was just saying how synergistic it is. I really like the archetypes in Vintage Masters, a few of them, that is. I'll just talk a little bit about Storm. So Storm is something, there are a lot of myths concerning in the set. I've talked to a lot of people who think Storm is just bad or Storm just isn't real, but coming from me might not mean a ton because I'm not really a Storm aficionado, but Storm is very real. You have some insane cards, and again, this is one of the really nice things about it being a set versus a cube. So you have to like either open the right rares or get past the right rares, and people do pass the right rares. So for instance, something like Yawgmoth's Bargain, even Yawgmoth's Will, those are cards in the set. And again, with Power 9, you can even put like a Black Lotus in your Storm deck. And
if you're lucky.
Right, but even without being super lucky, it's really not too crazy to pull off a Storm win. You have Frantic Search at common, Brain Freeze at uncommon. You can really do some pretty crazy things. I think High Tide is in the set. The Storm decks are hard to play, and I would say most people trying to play Storm don't get there, which is, I think, what leads to this idea that, oh, Storm can't be very good because I always beat the Storm players I run into. Because Storm is just hard, and, people punt more when they play hard decks. So
yeah, I have to say I suck at playing Storm. And I've drafted Storm decks which I thought were very good, better than I see other people draft them, but then they trophy and I just kill myself in 3 games or so, maybe win 1 match, and then in the end, sometimes I kill myself and sometimes I get defeated, basically.
yeah, and sometimes you have the choice. Sometimes, you have like a channel or something, and you can just choose to pay all your life, or again, Yogg Bargain.
Yeah, that.
Right. So next up is Kaldheim. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little about recent Magic set design. We just had Zendikar Rising, and a couple mechanics in that set were Kicker and Wizard Tribal. Those sound familiar? They should, because we also had them back in Dominaria. Now in Kaldheim, we have Changelings and Snow. This time, those are 2 mechanics we had back in Modern Horizons. So what do Dominaria and Modern Horizons have in common? They were very popular limited sets. So I noticed that Wizards is actively calling back to previously popular limited environments, which I think is very clever. With 1 mechanic per set, I don't think it would say much, but with 2 per set, it feels deliberate. Just wanted to point that out. All right, now on to Kaldheim as a set.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it for the flavor. I'm also excited to play the format itself, the draft format, but there's only a few cards that I really already set my eye on for our cubes. And that said, it's now probably a very peasant cube focus again, since that's what we mostly build and draft. But I think it's kind of our niche now, more or less. Many other people talk about more powerful cubes. So yeah, do you want to start with a pick about a card or a cycle that you are excited about?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things I am pretty excited about is the return of sagas, specifically the sagas at uncommon. I think most of those look really cool. Sagas, I think, are a really, really popular card type. And to me, they're just like planeswalkers done right. They're a little bit less interactive. You can't attack a saga the way you can attack a planeswalker, but the idea that you have a value engine that's only going to be around for a few turns, you don't have the flexibility of a planeswalker, and you don't really have an ultimate the same way you do on a planeswalker. Like, for instance, I think the uncommon sagas in this set are going to be much preferred to say, some of the uncommon planeswalkers from War of the Spark. But yeah, I think the sagas, most of them, there are a couple stinkers still, but most of them I think look pretty sweet.
Yeah, and some of them are really very interesting designs. For example, the blue-black uncommon one, I think, is a very cool design. It's 2 black and blue, and chapter 1, you may exchange control of 2 target creatures. And then chapter 2, you may exchange control of 2 target non-basic, non-creature permanents that share a card type. And then 3 is target player loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. And what I think is super cool about it is it's basically a steel enchantment with upside, or that does even more. Because in chapter 2, you can just exchange control of the heist with any enchantment your opponent has. And they get your saga, which then does the last chapter, which is just lightning helixing you, and you have their forever. And I don't know, it's pretty cool that this card can do that.
Right, yeah. It's definitely something they thought about, right? It doesn't say other,
yes,
like non-basic, non-creature permanent. So
for sure they did. And that really makes the card feel like the heist, right? Like the pulling off the heist.
Yeah. Another thing I'm pretty excited about in the set would be the uncommon lands that tap for 1 color of mana, but for 2 different colors of mana, you can sacrifice them. Usually, well, some of them are at sorcery speed, some of them aren't. I think most are probably at sorcery speed, so they're not dual lands, but then they make that cost to sacrifice it like kind of unsplashable. So it's 2 of each color in the color pair. So for instance, red, green, green, but instead of being red, red, green, green, if the land taps for red, they just remove a red symbol because you're tapping that. Fortunately, some strong abilities on them. They're good mana sinks. I would love if they were mana fixing, but I think they would probably just be too good if they tapped for multiple colors. So
probably,
I think most of them are pretty neat. I will say one of these I am particularly unexcited about. It's the one I already mentioned. I know it's one you like, but back in Dominaria, when we had utility lands like this before that you could sacrifice for some powerful effect, we had Memorial to War, the red uncommon memorial, and that thing you could sacrifice to destroy a land, which I suppose could have been good versus other memorials.
It just stinks so badly.
Yeah, and it's really just like a abysmal card. This one is definitely less abysmal, but I'm still not very happy about it. It's called, I think, Notvold Slumber Mound, which is quite the name. And I think for a total of 7 mana, I was counting itself. But yeah, you can destroy a land. But this time you do get a 4/4 with trample out of the deal, so it's like much more respectable.
And not at sorcery speed, this one.
That's a fair point. I really am a little disappointed though, because why are we destroying lands at like 7 mana total? That just it just doesn't make sense to me. Why is this something we're interested in doing?
Time you actually get something nice out of it. Like having a land turn into a 4/4 trampler, that's very good. And I think just that one is so much more relevant than some of the other ones.
Yeah, I guess I could see that, but don't you think that for Gruul it would make a lot more sense to have that ability cheaper and just not destroy a land? Like, say it's 5 mana total.
Yeah, probably that would be much better. But I still somehow really like it. I don't know. Any excuse to destroy land.
Fair enough. I think it would be sweet in maybe your Peasant Cube where you have red-green designated as like a ramp archetype. For me,
yes,
in my Peasant Cube where I'm trying to do like Ferocious, it's just so sad because it makes a creature that's good. It's the right size. That's just so much mana to activate, and my Gruul decks really don't want to be ramping. They want to be attacking. So you want to talk about some of the things you're excited about in this set?
Yeah, so the first card that when it was spoiled I was excited about was the Path to the World Tree, because I'm trying to support green-white Enchantress in my cube now. And it's for 1 and a green, an enchantment, and when it comes into play, you search your library for a basic land card and put it into your hand, not into play. So it's not super good. But this green-white Enchantress deck also is supposed to be a little bit 5 colors, dabble into 5 colors. because I have some of the shrines in all colors and double shrines in green and white. And that one then just fits in there because it has another ability for 2 colorless and Wooburg. You sacrifice it, then you gain 2 life, you draw 2 cards, target opponent loses 2 life, it deals 2 damage to up to 1 target creature, and you get a 2/2 green bear creature token. There's a lot of small things, but if you think about it, if it will fix your mana for your whatever shrine, it will trigger maybe an enchantress, and then later you might sacrifice it for some more cards. I think there's something there. Probably not a very high pick in the cube, but a really fun card for the archetype. So I'm quite excited about that.
Yeah, I agree. It's a sweet one. And I think, especially if you're trying to do like some kind of 5-color shrines thing, I think this is a card that makes a lot of sense in that kind of environment.
Yeah, in the Limited Resources podcast, I gave it, I think, a D or something, or a pretty bad grade. But I will try it anyway, running it in my cube. And I don't know, maybe it's just fun, but I'm pretty sure it's at least fun.
Right. What else are you excited about? I know there are a few things for sure.
Yeah, there's one of the uncommon legendary creatures I'm quite excited about. It's in red-green, Svella the Ice Shaper. It's a 1 red-green, 2/4. And for 3 generic and tap, you create an Icy Manalith. So it's an artifact that taps for any color of mana. But for 6 red and green, you look at the top 4 cards of your library, and you may cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So I really like that card because in red and green, the archetype in my cube is ramp, but there's not that many red-green gold cards that show off this ramp archetype well. And this really does. Like, it does the ramping, it does the payoff, and it is a solid body. And yeah, I think it's really nice.
I agree. I think it's a pretty good signpost for your archetype, and it makes
strong.
Makes the Slumber Mound look a little bit more reasonable. Yeah, no, I agree that the Svella is a cool card, and Icy Manalith. I couldn't get over that when I first read this card. I was like, there has to be a better name, and I thought about it for a minute, and I was like, I really have no idea what that name would be. Like, I'm sure this is just like a playtest name that's stuck. And
yeah.
It's a cool card.
Yeah, and then I'm very excited about the snow duels because I don't care about the snow at all, and I'm pretty sure that at least in the cubes I have already, I mean, there's also the pyramid cube, and these will go in there too. I will not support snow, I'm pretty sure. It really takes a lot of space to support snow, but these are just lands that come into play tapped at common even, and they have the land types. So yeah, Alpine Meadow, Mountain and Plains. Meaning that with the old Mirage fetch lands at Peasant, you can now really fix your mana very well. Sadly, that old fetch land cycle is never completed, but still, I'm taking them. I'm very happy about this.
The old Mirage cycle, speaking of, that's something in Vintage Masters, and that's been one of my favorite things to play with because it doesn't feel like they're overly powerful, and you're really discouraged from cracking them if you're trying to hit land drops. And I think that's just way more interesting to play with than like traditional fetch lands in cubes, because most of the time there you're just cracking them as soon as possible. You get your shock land or whatever, and then you go about your day. But I really like the Mirage fetches. I would love to see that cycle completed. And idea of like, well, you're playing at turn 1. It's probably not a huge downside if you get something tapped, and then now there's even more play to them if you're in Peasant, like fetching up lands that have to enter tapped.
Yeah, double tapped. Very slow, but it's very good fixing.
Right, yeah. And the other thing is like you don't have to get like a duel, right? If you need mana right after you play the Mirage fetches, then you can still just fetch a basic the turn after you play them. Yeah, I agree that Snowlands, I'm not sure they're going to do a ton for your cube or mine, but I think for cubes in general, they're really cool. I think they look amazing. Definitely, at least visually, an upgrade to Guild Gates, right? And I really like Wizards is like doing more with land types. Like, I think we're starting to realize that as long as lands enter tapped, they can have pipes and it's not going to be too scary. Like we saw that with triomes, right? And did not see that exactly with the lands in Throne of Eldraine, right? We still have the blue Throne of Eldraine common island thing show up in a bunch of constructed formats, but
yeah, that is a bit of a, but it's the odd one out, right? The other ones are all very fine because the advantage they give is something desirable in not in archetypes, in formats where people do degenerate things with fetch lands. The last one is another land. It's the Shimmerdrift Vale. I would say for paper Magic, it's the fixed Terramorphic Expanse or Evolving Wilds. So it's a snow land. Snow I don't care much about. It enters the battlefield tapped, but when it comes into play, choose a color and then you add mana of the chosen color. And I think that is much more elegant design than having to fetch. It's most of the time weaker, but I just like it. And one more of these effects might find its way into some cubes of mine, maybe not, but it might. And if you play with paper, I think it's just better. Having to shuffle is just annoying. And this basically does the same thing.
Sure. Yeah. This reminds me a lot of the Thriving Lands from Jumpstart. And I do prefer the Thriving Lands, but this is it's a decent card in its own right. Like, yes, in terms of gameplay, I think not shuffling is nice. I still like being able to fetch later if you don't necessarily know what you want to get, but most of the time you will, or you can just not play this land right away. So yeah, I think this is a sweet card too.
So do you have anything left on your list of cards you want to talk about?
I do. So I really like a lot of the themes in the set. For instance, I like the snow theme. Snow is one of my favorite things that Magic does, because I think like the kind of mini game of how highly do you pick snowlands or guild gates or deserts? That's just always been like a really interesting question, and I think it adds a lot to drafting environments. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, it's sweet for drafting. It's not so great for constructed, but who cares? Not we.
Yeah, right. In what is it? 90+% of cards just never do anything in constructed anyway. So
yeah.
So yeah, I'm excited about that. I'm also excited about Changeling as a theme. I really like that old ability. It's a little bit awkward because, I mean, we just had Zendikar Rising where we went really far out of the way to come up with like a weird Changeling-esque ability for a couple cards in that set that had like all of the party types. And it felt like Changeling could have returned then. Like we still had the rule where Changeling does not count for more than one type at a time toward party. I'm happy to see it back at this point. Also, just for tribal decks and casual things in general, I think people really like Changeling, just supporting like whatever tribal thing they're doing on a casual constructed level.
I remember back when I was really playing kitchen table Magic at home when I got started. Sometimes we built tribal decks just restricted by which tribes we had enough cards for. Like, didn't matter if they were good.
Right. And yeah. So something interesting that I think these two mechanics like combine is that they're both really good for chaos. The sense that snow and chaos has always been like very dubious and not very significant because, I mean, how are you ever putting synergy together in chaos consistently? No. It does show up, especially tribal synergy. So these changelings, there are definitely some powerful cards in Magic's history that care about certain creature types. So I think the changelings are going to be a hit for chaos in that sense. I think that just having some more snow and just a lot of the cool lands in the set, common, uncommon, I think, yeah, this is just going to be a nice set for chaos. It's going to age well, I think. There's one thing that really turned me off from this set pretty early on in spoiler season, and that was just a couple 4-mana commons, one in green and one in blue. The blue one is called Augury Raven. 3 and a blue for a 3/3 flying, which is pretty good. And then it also has Foretell. So for 1 and a blue, you can exile it face down, and then on a later turn, note that later turn doesn't mean one of your turns later. Obviously, this would have to have flash to work on your opponent's turn, but just keep in mind how Foretell works with instants. It basically does not make you wait a whole turn cycle, right? So for 1 and a blue, after paying 2 to exile it face down, you can sort of morph it up and cast it. And yeah, Foretell is definitely, I think, a callback to morph, and it's an interesting ability. I don't know if we'll ever see it repeated, but the idea that 4 mana 3/3 flying wasn't good enough, so they put another ability on it to like split the mana across like a couple turns, just so insane to me. Like, we haven't had a 4 mana 3/3 flyer at common for so many years. Like, it's been so
and now we're already like a step further.
Yeah, it's just, I really have no idea what's going on here. It's like they're like trying to make the draft format more exciting. They're making it less exciting for me because it's just an obscene card to have. Like, I don't think we're ready for it. Like, we just had 4 mana 3/2 draw card, right, in Zendikar Rising. Now we're going again multiple steps up, 3 toughness and Foretell. It just makes me think like, I like, when is the
Crazy, yeah.
I'm trying to understand how Magic is going to continue on this trend, because I mean, I like cards getting better. I think it's good for the game. I think it entices more players, but I just think this is a really, really steep rate for cards to improve, and I don't know about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about those cards either. Like, I will obviously play them, but it's not really that exciting. I don't know. I was thinking about when looking at the spoiler, Foretell versus Echo, because basically you spend mana and then you have to spend mana again, but only the second time you pay, you get the thing you want. That sounds a bit worse than Echo, right? That you pay it, you get it now, but later you have to pay again. And people hated Echo, even though, like, when I do this comparison, it sounds better. But the one is an upside that maybe often you want to use, and the other one is a downside, more or less. You still pay in installments, which might be good for you, but I don't know. Like, I think these are a little bit similar, the mechanics, but one is phrased as a drawback, and therefore people dislike it. I think it's very like interesting with what it does to the mind of the player.
Yeah, I think that's a really clever comparison, and I think it's a clever design too from Wizards if they had Echo in mind, which I'm not totally sure they did. I think one of the other reasons it doesn't feel like a downside mechanic is because at the end of the day, you still have an option, right? You can just pay full price, and you can, and players love options. Right? So maybe that was the solution for Echo originally. You just put a regular casting cost on there versus an Echo cost. And as long as the Echo cost is cheap enough, maybe suddenly it's a super popular mechanic instead of a really hated
I think
one.
so.
That's all it took.
But it's really just about, I mean, the power level obviously is pretty different. Most of the Echo cards weren't that great. But I mean, there were 2 mana, 2/4s, which at that point was pretty crazy. And then you would just have to pay that again. I don't know. Yeah.
There were definitely some really insane cards with Echo for the rate that you would cast it the first time. But then once you pay for it the second time, it's starting to look a little bit more fair.
Yes.
Kind of a side note, I really, really dislike that Echo had to be errated. I really liked Echo as just that word, then you pay the casting cost again. I think it was Time Spiral block when they changed it to like Echo can be like a sack 2 lands kind of thing for like Skizzic Surger.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, the Surger was only in Future Sight, I think, but they changed already in Time Spiral, and there were some other weird costs. Sometimes they were just different from the original cost or so. Yeah.
Speaking of Time Spiral, we have Time Spiral Remastered, which I think releases in a couple months. So probably our next episode, I think, will be, well, we might be talking about spoilers for that set. I'm very, very excited for that. I think that's going to be my highlight of the year.
I don't know. I always love just the flashback drafts. I hope this will be as good. I don't know.
Fair, yeah.
What would you prefer? If we have no Sprout Swarm at all or Sprout Swarm at rare?
I think Sprout Swarm is just not a good card. I think like, it's one thing to have like a creature with an activated ability that is completely insane, like the more you activate it, right? But the idea that it's a card in your hand, which really means like, yes, blue can counter it, black can make you discard it, but like red, green, and white, like what do they do? So I don't know. I don't think Sprout Swarm should show up, and I think they guaranteed that it wouldn't, right? So that's nice.
I think I kind of would like it at rare, mythic rare. So like if once while I play it shows up or something like that, I'm totally fine with it. At current was obviously one of the biggest mistakes ever.
One more thought about Foretell.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like in Kaldheim, there's the theme of if you play 2 spells, then you get a trigger or something. 2 spells per turn. And Foretell is part of the things that enable that. And I was thinking if it is possible to enable with Foretell and other mechanics across the board, like for example also suspend the way they did it in Time Spiral. Is it possible to get at Peasant Cube power level Storm into a cube without it being super parasitic? Like, I mean, like without putting a million rituals. I mean, there are many of them. You could just put a bunch of rituals, but they would then just only go in the Storm deck.
Right.
And yeah, I think maybe my next project will be designing a Peasant Cube around Storm. Because
really
also
exciting.
people really enjoyed it in Temur Cube. And yeah, the only issue with Storm I have at that point is probably too many people would want to draft Storm, which would make it a terrible experience for everyone. I don't know.
I think one of the things you can do to offset that a little, as I'm sort of working with my own Storm-esque archetype in my cube, is either not tell people about it so they kind of have to discover it for themselves, or make it not very powerful. Because if you make it something that you really need a lot of like skill and luck to get to work, then I think most people aren't going to go for it anyway.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so Foretell. In terms of Foretell, I'm really excited about the blue-white uncommon legend Vega the Watcher, which is 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer for white and blue. So I mean that's already pretty squarely in my my territory. But whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, you draw a card. And this just highlights something that I think is like extremely good design on the part of Wizards, which is actually just the cycle of gilded legends at uncommon. Because with all these cards, with the 10 color pairs, right, you create something that's obviously going to get replayed over and over in limited, but also you give people like extra commanders. You give people the ability to look at a higher number of legendary creatures in the new set and find something that they might be excited about.
Yeah. And with Vega the Watcher specifically, it's very open-ended. Like it does not say a card with Foretell. Because if it said a card with Foretell, what would you do with it in Commander? Like a singleton format where you need 100 cards. It would never work. But they phrased it in a way where it works with Foretell cards, but also many other things. And that's
I think that's really, really great. So great, in fact, that my Vega EDH deck is almost done. So
oh wow.
Once the Kaldheim cards hit the MTGO market, I'm excited to definitely try that deck out instead of the Obika one that I've been running. I like the Obika one too, don't get me wrong, but I'm really looking forward to trying Vega too. Hopefully not too many of the cards will be super expensive, but I think this is a good time to say, yeah, we have recently started doing Commander games in our Discord. If you like Commander, in addition to any of the other formats we talk about, please join our Discord. We're a pretty open, welcoming community, I think, and yeah, pretty chill one as well. So if you want to hang out, play some games of Magic, come on over.
Yeah, draft with us our cubes. Maybe bring your own cube if you want. And we have so many people that are excited to discuss cards in your cube with you and give you input. I really enjoy that, and maybe you will too. So come on over.
And yeah, with that, I think that's about everything we wanted to talk about. Yeah, just a couple days from now, we should get that new alternative play calendar. That should be, of course, very exciting. It's going to determine a lot of what we talk about in the future.
Please give me some Chaos Draft.
And please give it to me like this week, because after that I'm going back to my last semester of undergrad and I won't have time to really jam it. Anyway.
Yeah, time. What is time?
Great. Well, thank you all for listening. Hope you have enjoyed this episode.
And see you next time. Happy cubing.
Bye.